Dr. Roy Grinker, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's really great to have you. When I saw the title of your book, I was really excited. I mean, it just inherently grabbed me as somebody trained in psychotherapy and so on. And so we're going to be discussing your very fascinating book, Everybody's Normal: How Culture Created the Stigma of Mental Illness. So before we get into that, though, I want to remark on the very interesting fact that you come from a long line of psychoanalysts. I believe you said your great-grandfather was a psychoanalyst,
That's
your
right.
grandfather was a psychoanalyst, your father was a psychoanalyst.
And I'm married to one.
And you're married to a psychoanalyst. Oh, my goodness. And somewhere along the line, you ended up becoming a cultural anthropologist. And so you thought you were going to be a psychoanalyst. What happened?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think that I really idolized my grandfather. He was a hero to me. I idolized my father a bit too, but my grandfather had this renown within the field of psychiatry. He was the founding editor of the Archives of General Psychiatry. He started the psychiatry department at the University of Chicago. He was one of Freud's last patients.
My goodness.
He was just a giant in the field. And I think I kind of didn't want to compete with him. And he was always telling me I was going to be a great psychiatrist and even better than him. And that was a little intimidating, to say the least.
It could be a heavy burden.
Yeah.
Expectation.
So when I got to college, I took an introduction to anthropology class. And the professor at Grinnell College, John Andelson, who I'm still in touch with, and he's an amazing person, he introduced us to psychological anthropology. And this sort of, bell went off, and I realized, wow, I could actually be a scholar of psychological things without having to be a doctor or a psychoanalyst. And so it was this kind of eureka moment for me. And, I also had grown up with a real desire to travel and to see different parts of the world. And so so I think that's often the way it is. One teacher, if you get one teacher, that one teacher change your life.
I took only one course in anthropology. It was in graduate school at the University of Michigan. And there was some kind of requirement, I think, to have some diversity. And it was a course in cultural anthropology by Leslie White. Have you ever heard that name?
Of course, Leslie White is a very famous anthropologist who started a way to integrate evolutionary thinking into cultural anthropology. We don't think that way anymore. At the time, he was quite a giant in the field of anthropology. So you class from one of the greats.
Yeah, that's good to hear. He was very impressive, and had it was late in his life, I think, and pretty charismatic, as I recall, but due probably to age, he had a hobby horse that he would just go off on over and over again, and it was the evilness of the insurance industry. And that was just a huge topic for him.
that is an interesting thing, because I don't know that he ever published on that. The interesting thing about anthropology in the early days, and also even during the 1980s when I was trained, is that if you wanted to apply anthropological knowledge to a real world situation, like critiquing the insurance industry, you were not considered to be a real anthropologist. The anthropologist was focusing their attention on, the big theoretical issues.
Yeah. I doubt that he wrote on it. I think he needed us a large lecture class to vent his feelings.
But it is interesting. The history of insurance is interesting. A lot of people do not know that the history of life insurance was bound up with slavery. It was only during slavery that people developed this idea that you could insure a life because the slave was property. And
Wow,
so,
I didn't know
so the
that.
origin of life insurance is actually in American and British slavery.
And today's Martin Luther King Day, so it's really appropriate to bring that up. Um, so, how do you see the work of a cultural anthropologist? I think you've just partly told us.
Well, I think the work of a cultural anthropologist is to cross disciplinary and cultural boundaries, to take the best of what various disciplines have to offer, like sociology and history and philosophy, and to apply that knowledge to the world, and to understand that we don't hold the ownership on the best way of doing things. I think that the primary goal of cultural anthropology, lots of people think, is to understand other cultures. But it's more than that. It's to understand cultures so that we can turn our perspective back to ourselves.
Right.
And see ourselves in a new light. I mean, this is what Margaret Mead did in the late 1920s, where she went to Samoa and she said, wow, the way that men and women and boys and girls think and relate is so different there. That must mean that the way in which we think about sex and gender in the United States is something we made and we constructed, because it's certainly not in nature, because there's so many differences all around the world. And if we see that something is culturally constructed rather than part of our nature, well, then we can change it. And in Nobody's Normal, I'm trying to do that as well. In this book, I'm trying to say that we stigmatize mental illnesses not because they are inherently shameful or inherently should be secret or causes for a kind of branding of a disreputable personality. We stigmatize mental illnesses because our culture teaches us to do that.
Yeah, right? we're gonna get into that in more depth. A person could make the error from the title, I think, of thinking that you say nobody's normal, that maybe you're questioning that there is mental illness, and that's not the case of what you're doing, is it?
Not at all. Not at all. I mean, I am trying to make the point that human beings all exist on a spectrum, and that normal is something that is a judgment call. And the term has been used so often to paired with the word abnormality to decide, who we accept and who we reject and who we think is good and who we think is bad, that it's really a burdensome concept. Are you normal? Are you not normal? The point is that normality is a illusion that we have constructed. We don't know what's normal. What is normal? In the old days, normal meant average. It was a mathematical term.
Yeah,
and
right.
Only, later that it became this sort of thing to aspire to.
And you also take up the issue of normality versus conformity. Those two can sometimes be the same thing. Tell us about that.
Sometimes they can't. I mean, in terms of normality, not conforming, not being part of conformity. When Kinsey, published his works on sexual behavior, he found that it was normal for people to have some homosexual experience during their life, meaning that it was typical.
Yeah.
But then that wasn't necessarily what we thought was conformity, right?
Right.
And in other times, like in the age of conformity after World War II, normal meant, being like everybody else.
Yeah.
Or like you thought everybody was, the white picket fence and the spouse and the two kids and the dog.
Right. I want to show people your book. Those of you who are watching this on YouTube, it's a pretty hefty volume, but just really packed with all sorts of very fascinating facts, very wide ranging. Who did you have in mind when you wrote this book, by the way?
As the audience,
Yeah.
I wanted it to be a book that would be, this is ambitious, but I wanted it to be a book for everybody. I wanted scholars to be able to say that it was well researched and erudite.
I have that impression as well.
Patients and advocates to be able to say, yeah, what he's saying there about shame and stigma relates to how I've experienced things in my life, and I want to be on board with his message. And I wanted mental health professionals to learn from it, because it's amazing how many people who are in the clinical area really don't know the history of their field. This is not a critique of clinicians, but it is a critique of the education of clinicians.
Yeah.
That
okay.
we often don't train, particularly medical doctors. We often don't train them in understanding the larger contexts in which their ideas developed, and so you get trained, say, in child psychiatry, and you get trained that Asperger's is real. It's a real disorder, but it's like anything else, it's made up in order to be a framework for understanding a particular set or constellation of symptoms. We train internists to diagnose hypertension, and yet the values for hypertension change with every generation because doctors decide on new estimates for it, and there's no natural number, no number in nature that says this is high, this is medium, this is normal, this is abnormal. That we have to let people know that the way in which we think about the body medically is something that we have constructed, and it changes all the time. And that's why I go through so much of the history in Nobody's Normal.
Yeah. You mentioned that you're seeing things being on a spectrum rather than absolute this, absolute that. And certainly we've all heard that in relation to things like ADHD, but it sounds like you see that in a broader kind of context. You mentioned to me that there was a passage you might want to read relating to the idea of the spectrum. Maybe this is a good place to do that.
Sure, I can.
I'd like people to get a sense of your writing because it's very readable.
Thank you. Well, to set up the passage, I'm really talking about how when we decide that something is a mental illness, is not a mental illness, something is normal or abnormal, it's a judgment call we make. We all know the difference between, say, the two colors of yellow and orange, right? But I don't think any of us could agree that there's some spot where you could find on the spectrum where now it turns from yellow to orange, or now it turns from orange to red. That, you don't divide up human behavior and the human mind so easily. So what I wrote about the spectrum, which I'm a big fan of, is, and it's on page 323, a spectrum presents an opportunity for people and their healthcare providers to negotiate perceptions of health over time as symptoms change or improve. A spectrum not only challenges the diagnostic stability that so often underlies stigma, as if once labeled, you are always labeled, but also the presumption that everyone with a particular diagnosis is the same. The spectrum is an invitation. It asks us to join the rest of the world on a continuum of suffering. It asks us to say, along with neurodiversity advocates, that both normality and abnormality are fictional lands no one actually inhabits.
That makes me think of digital versus analog in the field of electronics and music and so on. So that, for example, musical aficionados can hear things in analog recordings that are lost in digital recordings, because the world is not a digital world, even though we've managed to chop it up. And there are ways in which that's useful. But we live in an analog world where everything is in a continuum.
That's right. And so if everything is on a continuum, when we make decisions about what something is or is not, That is a decision made in large part by whatever you have been sensitized to think, or the way that you've been taught to divide up the world. So
Yeah.
it's a great example you use of the analog and the digital, because if you do look for the differences, you can find them. But you have to be primed to look for those differences.
Right.
You have to be primed to think about something like music and in terms of analog digital. And then you have to be primed to look for the particular characteristics of what makes that sound different.
Yeah.
And, you think about a mental health professional being trained, they have to be sensitized to looking for particular characteristics that make this person distinct or different from someone else. And you develop that eye or that ear for...
I was thinking about my own experience in graduate school, which was very psychoanalytic, by the way. At that time, the psychology department at the University of Michigan was very psychoanalytic. And I rankled under the distinctions that they were making. I was, partly, that's probably why the title grabbed me so much, Nobody's Normal. My experience was, well, nobody seems that abnormal. Most people don't seem that abnormal. People who are being hung with having this kind of character disorder or that kind of character disorder, you really have to learn those distinctions to begin to see them and to eventually realize, well, they may actually have some implications for treatment.
Saying nobody's normal doesn't mean that everybody needs treatment. But because, again, that is the judgment call on the spectrum. At what point does this particular set of characteristics become something that is unbearable, or that prevents you from doing your job, or from participating in your family or social life the way that you want? And that's when, intervention in mental health care can really help. And we need to break down the stigma so that those people who do get on that side of the spectrum don't have barriers to care.
Tell us about the word stigma. There's a place where you kind of defined stigma that surprised me. Do you remember that?
It's used in so many people talk about the stigma of unwed mothers, or the stigma of being a victim of sexual violence, or the stigma of being a Republican, whatever it might be. People use stigma in so many ways, but it comes from an ancient Greek term, stigmata, which meant the marking on the brand or the flesh, particularly for slaves and criminals in ancient Greece. But it has come to mean, in Christianity, the marks on Christ's hands and feet from the crucifixion, and then in general discourse to mean a branding of a person as a discredited kind of identity. And so that's where it comes from. That's where the word comes from, and we use it a lot. And I don't think we can get rid of it because it's so much a part of our language. But maybe when we use it, if we understood the history of it as a little more, and if we understood how the term helps us to illuminate certain aspects of suffering, then I think we can still use the term, as long as we don't just sort of see it as a black hole that takes all discussion. Oh, well, it's stigma. Well, it's stigma. Well, we need to think more, clearly about different kinds of stigma, and also the kinds of historical forces that have created it.
Right. I relate it in part to the human tendency to make judgments about people who are in the out group, that we struggle between sort of me and not me, ours and not ours, depending upon who we identify with and how we were raised and so on.
Yeah, we often make ourselves feel better by saying, well, at least I'm not this.
Yeah, so I'm not sure to what degree we can get rid of stigma, although I certainly think we should, to the extent that we're able to do that.
Let me give you an example of the way in which stigma works with a lot of conditions. So when somebody has schizophrenia, we think about schizophrenia as something that is not curable, and it is a label that lasts, and you are a person with schizophrenia, or as people used to say, a schizophrenic, forever. It's this brand. It is this sort of lasting label.
Right.
But there are many societies in the world, like the community that I spent time with in Namibia, the Jumkwasi hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari Desert, who think that you are sick with something only when you have symptoms. So there's a man that I met there named Tomzo, who hears voices, has delusions, and he takes chlorpromazine, a antipsychotic medication, which for the time being is controlling his symptoms. And so you ask people, is he sick? And they go, oh no, he's not sick. He was before. And he could get sick again, but he's not sick now. And so there's not this idea of a label, and they certainly don't have their own word for schizophrenia, that persists over time. But if you go just 12 miles away to the clinic where he gets his antipsychotic meds, he's written down there on a list as schizophrenic. And so he's got this sort of lasting brand label in the clinic, but he doesn't when he's at home. And so different societies fashion different ways of classifying and marking people or not marking them.
Seems like I've heard of instances in so-called primitive societies where a person might go kind of berserk. I think the word kind of comes from this phenomenon. And it was more of a temporary thing. It's like, oh, so-and-so's running around with a machete. You got to avoid him because right now he's in that place where he gets every now and then.
Yeah, well, that's where we get the word amok from. It's the Malaysian, I think it's Malaysian illness with a kind of temporary, hysteria or insanity, and that illness is called amok. And we got that.
That must have been what was planted somewhere in my brain.
Yeah, but berserk may be related to some metaphors around bears that are used in some societies, or I'm not sure. I'd have to look into it. But you're right. There are forms of temporary psychosis, and actually, there are lots of people who hear voices who don't have schizophrenia.
I was going to mention my grandmother, who was an evangelical Christian, and she would hear voices, but nobody thought she was, quote, schizophrenic, or did she have any symptoms that, other than that, the occasional vision, the occasional speaking in tongues, etc. She did manage the world very well.
Yeah, and one of the things, just to bring up, you might have noticed I'm using the word illness. But if you were to look in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, you'd see the word disorder. I find disorder related to those ideas of like amok and berserk and, screw loose and all those, falling apart or breaking down. I don't really buy into this notion of something that's in disorder. And so just so your listeners know, I use the term mental illness rather than disorder. Illness is about the experience of the sufferer, whereas disorder might be some, doctor's
more of an external judgment.
Yeah,
disorder.
It's an external judgment, and it's it's like it's medical language.
Yeah.
Saying disorder or disease, illness. That's really more about the full experience of the sufferer and the facets of that person's life, what kind of care they get, how they experience their symptoms, how their social life changes or their social support network changes around their condition. That's where the illness draws our attention. Disorder draws our attention to some kind of biological framework that I think is not very consistent with how most of us experience emotional distress.
Yeah, I would not have thought of going at it from that angle of looking at the suffering and the experience of the person rather than the judgment of the, quotes, expert.
There's something still stigmatizing, I guess, about the phrase mental illness or even mental disorder. If you look at NIH, all the institutes at the National Institute of Health, they have the National Cancer Institute and the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases and National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke. And then we have the National Institute of Mental Health. It's still so stigmatizing that we can't even say the National Institute of Mental Illness, right? It's a way of kind of softening it for people.
Yeah.
We talk about mental health much more than we talk about mental illness. I think that's a sign of our continued discomfort with mental illnesses, the kind of thing we have to get over.
Huh. Huh. You, in your book, you cover some, you've organized it in place of under some very broad themes that for me were a little bit unexpected. One was capitalism. So talk to us about how does capitalism cross-cut these issues of mental illness, mental health, stigma, judgment, the development of our thinking around all that.
Right. So you're right. Nobody's normal is divided into three parts, and the first part is called capitalism. It's not that I think that capitalism is the main mechanism everywhere that leads to the classification and stigmatization of mental illnesses, but in the history of Western Europe and North America, capitalism was that mechanism. Until we had developed in Western Europe at the beginnings of capitalism in the 1700s and the 1800s, the idea that the ideal individual was an autonomous individual producer who maximized his or her gain and was master of their world, as de Tocqueville put it when he wrote about America. Until that happened, we did not have diagnoses of mental illnesses or insane asylums, or the idea that there was something that was a distinct mental disorder. Until the first asylums are built, we don't even have prisons in Western Europe, because prisons were for just, anybody who, prisons and asylums were the same thing. Until the mentally ill are identified as a distinct group of people and separated out from criminals, we don't even have prisons, and prisons don't become common until the 1800s in Western Europe. So capitalism is not just about the economy. It's about constructing a certain ideal kind of person, and a kind of person who I don't think exists, right? This totally independent, autonomous person. To be human is to be dependent on others. To be a human is to have some weaknesses. To be human is to have illness and disability. And yet what capitalism did was to create this ideal human being that we would then stigmatize if they were sick or if they were disabled.
I'm thinking of Ayn Rand's.
Sorry, let me just add one thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. That it was only, in capitalism when people who didn't work were sent to asylums. They could have been criminals. They could have been people with physical disabilities, maybe substance abuse problems, whatever. And it was only then, because they were sent to asylums, that clinicians, doctors, scientists, for the very first time, had a large enough group of people in a single space where they could say, oh, we can separate these people out into those who have intellectual disabilities, or those who have hear voices, and those who are depressed, and so on. So no mental illness concepts were developed until capitalism necessitated grouping all of these people together in asylums.
Yeah. Fascinating. I was thinking of Ayn Rand, whose writing really projected the ideal of the self-contained master of your own fate kind of person.
Yes.
The business tycoon who's totally self-created and rather merciless.
Well, you can go back to de Tocqueville, and the way de Tocqueville characterized what he said the American ideal is. The person who is subservient to no one and is free and autonomous, and they take responsibility, personal responsibility, for everything that happens to them. And you can go back to Descartes, where Descartes argues for basically the existence of the autonomous individual. I think, therefore I am. And the
Uh-huh.
only thing he could be sure of was that he was an individual, a
Yeah.
human being. And then others in the Enlightenment arguing that perfection involved the perfection of the individual. So this sort of glamorization and idealization of the individual is really at the heart of capitalism. And it's also at the heart of how we have stigmatized people who are not autonomous, who are not independent, who need others, who suffer, and who don't achieve and work in the same way that we think is the ideal.
Yeah. Yeah. Another major category that section of the book is wars, and that was a little bit unexpected too. So, how have wars impacted our judgments around categorizing human suffering and
Yeah.
treating it?
Well, there are two things that really led me to focus on war. One was the fact that my grandfather ran psychiatric operations in the North African theater, particularly for the Tunisian campaign in World War II, and it shaped his career because it was there that he developed an interest in treating the common mental illnesses, not just people who were going to be in institutions, but people who had mild, short-term or self-limiting depression or anxiety and so on, like the soldiers who experienced distress in combat or in anticipation of combat. The second thing that got me thinking about it was when the journal Nature asked me to write a piece on the DSM. And I started doing research on the DSM and realized that the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was originally a medical document. It was an Army manual of mental disorder,
Huh, huh,
which after the war, President Truman ordered be revised for civilian use. And so they revised the Army manual, and that became the DSM-1. We're now at
yeah,
DSM-5, of course. And so I realized then just how much the psychological professions, psychiatry and psychology, counseling in general, owe to wars. That in wars, the mental health knowledge and mental health professions took big leaps. And there was often a kind of regression back into some inactivity. But whether it was World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and now the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we see that wars stimulate a real reorganization of how we think about the human mind. If we go and look at wars, not only do we see big changes in the mental health professions that then generalize to the civilian world afterwards, but we also see in wars the kind of normalization of emotional distress. It's expected or typical for people to experience mental illnesses during war because of the stresses of it. And
yeah,
it's not your fault. It's not your fault that you have PTSD from, seeing your friends harmed or killed in combat. My grandfather and others during wars made the point to the public that mental illnesses like post-traumatic stress disorder or like anxiety or depression in the aftermath of combat is not abnormal, that it is not a sign of weakness, and that getting care is a sign of resilience. So I actually think, and I argue this in Nobody's Normal, that the military has done more to address the stigma of mental illness in the last 15, 20 years than any other sector of American society. And they've had a real singular focus on it.
huh. One of the things that comes to mind is my whole training and profession really was born of largely of the Second World War, where the Veterans Administration got funded and the decision was made that there aren't enough psychiatrists around to deal with these issues. So we need another field called psychology, clinical psychology, et cetera. And so funding from the VA helped get me through graduate school because I had internships at several VA hospitals. So
Yeah.
there's a tight bonding really between war, and it's interesting that war is a laboratory in which people are broken. You know, people get broken. So yeah, this is a good opportunity to learn something about human nature, human fragility, and vulnerability,
Well, and I think that,
as well as strength.
well, I think this point relates to the pandemic as well.
I
Uh,
wanted to ask you about that.
I mean, because this is a kind of, this is a global crisis, right?
Yeah,
And there are mental health consequences to it. Um, but one wonders if, like wars, or like as in wars, we can leverage the understanding of how the COVID pandemic has been affecting our mental health um, to make strides toward reducing the stigma of mental illness. To say, as they did in World War II, hey, you're under enormous stress. It
yeah,
is not abnormal or shameful for you to be scared or for you to be depressed or anxious or whatever it might be. That it is expected, it is human
yeah,
to react this way. I mean, I'm not a biological anthropologist, but maybe I know more than the average person about biological anthropology as it being in this field. And, we talk a lot in anthropology about the evolution of anxiety and the evolution of fear and the evolution of the, stimulus and flight and so on, and how those things evolve. It is normal to get anxious. If we weren't anxious, we'd probably all be at great risk of harm.
yeah,
Because we would cross the street when the light was red. We wouldn't take care. So anxiety is an enormously quote unquote normal thing. It can become abnormal if it impairs your life. So, but anxiety itself is not pathology, and it's a matter of degree. And that is what the military psychiatrists in the various wars have argued as well.
yeah. And still people struggle to take that in. People who therapy, actually, I've been noticing, has been veering in some quarters more towards a psychoeducational approach to persuade the sufferers that what they've gone through could be expected to produce the suffering that they're experiencing, and that there's no moral blame. That's the thing we still carry. And you talk about the impact of Christianity, of culture, Judeo-Christian, versus the some of the other, like in Asian cultures and Muslim cultures. Talk about some of those differences. We're jumping around a little bit, but I found that very interesting.
Yeah, the point that you're making bears repeating, that when we identify the factors that influence mental illnesses as outside of the person, as it's not just their personality or their character, or they had bad parents or bad genes or whatever. There's something from the outside, a stressor.
Yeah.
That's when stigma decreases. And in Japan, so an interesting thing in the history of psychiatry and mental illness in Japan, which is that when before the 20th century in Japan, mental illnesses were seen as sort of a continuum of kind of normal human existence. Depression, anxiety, particularly depression, were seen as signs that a person was enduring the difficulties that life brought. And the person was confronting these things with all the human capacities that one should use. But it's when European psychiatry comes in to Japan, and Korea too, for that matter, in the late 1800s, when they first start to read European journal articles about something called mental illness, that they start to see the mental illnesses as brain diseases, as diseases of the person. And then mental illnesses became so stigmatized that nobody wanted to have them. Nobody could afford to have them. Nobody would admit to them. And there's been a change in the last couple of decades in Japan, where because of the stresses of capitalism, taking care of a very aging population, the stresses of trying to pass exams to get into higher education, that the typical image of the person who is mentally ill, indeed, the typical image of the person who's experiencing homelessness, is not somebody who has failed, but somebody who is facing these enormous stressors that are shared by all Japanese people. And so now you see mental health care on the rise in Japan. People saying that there are not enough psychotropic meds being used, that there are not enough counselors in order to address these mental illnesses that should bear no stigma. So it's interesting. One place, 100 years, and you can see it bounce back and forth.
Somewhere you used the word invention, and I'm trying to remember, was that the invention of mental illness?
Well, almost everything that is human is invented, but yes, mental illnesses were invented.
Yeah.
But we could pick anything, and any disease name or disease framework is an invention, something that we characterize. I think that just mental illnesses are perhaps a little easier for people to grasp as an invention, because we don't have numbers and laboratory tests to be able to say, but I have the disease right here in the microscope.
Yeah. Well.
But even if you see something in a microscope, that gets constructed as well. So invention is, I think, the right word, because until you had the asylums built in England and France in the 1700s, late 1600s, 1700s, there wasn't a notion that there was a distinct difference between a disease of the mind and a disease of the body. You may know, your listeners may know, that the first psychiatrists were called alienists.
Yeah.
Right? And that was not about being alienated from reality. It wasn't about being alienated from society. It was about the mind being alienated from the body, so that insanity, folie, was no longer just insanity, which of course just means unhealthy, but was folie mentale, not just alienation, but alienation mentale. And so there are still most societies in the world don't draw a distinction between the mind and the body, that they're diseases of the mind, diseases of the body. But we certainly do that in the United States, and I think that's a source of stigma.
Right now, of course, there is an attempt to look more holistically at mental health and health, to not see them as two separate domains.
That's tough. It's tough to do.
Yeah.
I'm thinking back to 1951. My grandfather was out of the war. He had seen both the prevalence of mental illness in World War II, but also he had seen people suffering psychologically from wounds, from physical wounds and diseases. And he had also seen people develop physical symptoms as the result of emotional stressors. And in 1951, he built a research institute in Chicago called the Psychiatric and Psychosomatic Institute for Research at a cost of $2 million. I don't know what that would be worth today, but it was 1951, it was $2 million. And he had a staff of several dozen people to study the psychological ramifications of biological illnesses like cancer, tuberculosis, other kinds of diseases. And it was really hard to get patients, because people wanted to see themselves as being physically sick, but not as emotionally sick. And as hard as my grandfather tried to say, there's no mental health without physical health, and no physical health without mental health. They have to have the two together. It was really hard. And you just think today about people who go to a primary care physician because they have fatigue or insomnia or stomach ache or diarrhea. And if the doctor says, maybe, I don't see anything wrong with you in my microscope, maybe you could get some mental health care, they respond with tremendous anger, as if they've been insulted, as if they're making up.
Yeah.
You think I'm making this up? I can't make
Okay.
up diarrhea.
Yeah.
Well, we know that physical and emotional symptoms come in every variety. And
Yeah.
sometimes physical illnesses create emotional issues, and sometimes it happens the other way around.
Well, it's still a struggle, right?
Yeah.
To get people to off of the expectation of the silver bullet pill and to see it in a context of their life and so on. It's as big a struggle as it ever was. And what about as an anthropologist? And you mentioned de Tocqueville. What about the idea of some of culture as imposing some very long-lasting forces on how we see ourselves and one another? Is that clear, what I'm asking?
Yeah, well, I think that's the point that I'm trying to make in the section on capitalism, which is that, we started this thing a long time ago, and it's still been with us for, until now. But I do try to make the argument that cultures always change, and that we seem to be going in a really good direction. I mean,
that's interesting.
I'm super optimistic.
Yeah, tell us more about that. We need optimism right now, as much as we can get.
Well, there's anecdotal evidence of just, my personal experience as a professor. I teach a large number of students, sometimes up to 330, 340 in one semester. Wow. So I see a lot of young people, and they are so open now about their disabilities or mental illnesses.
Yeah.
They,
some will brag about them.
Oh, they may, but I'm talking about the person who in class asks me if he can make an announcement to 290 people that he has Tourette's, and for them to understand that he may make some noises or even say something. That's a heroic, brave thing to do, but it is also something that has been made possible by a new kind of disposition to mental illnesses as part of what it means to be human. The student who said to me in one of my classes that the best day of her freshman year was when she was diagnosed with ADHD, because for the first time, somebody didn't see her as just lazy or stupid, that she had a condition that would help her understand her difficulties studying and organizing her thoughts. And so these are some signs. Celebrities, we know, are now coming out and saying, they have mental illnesses. David Letterman accepted his Mark Twain Award for humor at the John F. Kennedy Center in Washington by bringing his psychiatrist out on stage. When Ron Artest won the NBA Finals, he thanked his family, his teammates, and his psychiatrist for the LA Lakers. So
Lady Gaga has been very public about issues that she's facing and the help that she's gotten from psychiatric treatment.
Prince William as well. We now know that Pope Francis was once in treatment with a psychoanalyst in Argentina. So, I mean, we are starting to see a change in which some of the people we admire most are leading us, and they're saying, look, this is not shameful. This is part of being human. And there are ways that you can get care. And so, yes, I'm very optimistic about that. And then, there are quantitative figures too, beyond these anecdotes, like how much more selective psychiatric residencies are becoming because doctors, medical students are getting more interested in psychiatry. And so it's now getting more and more selective and very hard to get into good psychiatric residencies.
Interesting. I had not heard that. The common myth is that people go into psychiatry because they couldn't get into being surgeons or whatever.
Yeah, not so anymore. Not so.
That's not so? The pyramid is flipped?
It is really flippy. It's so funny because, if you may have encountered this in the book, but I talked about psychiatry being just such a disreputable profession in Europe in the 1800s, that the only profession that was less reputable was dermatology, because it was mostly treating syphilitic sores. And today, I recently heard a psychiatrist say that about psychiatric residencies, that psychiatry is the new dermatology. So they're paired again, but because dermatology is the most selective, the hardest residency program to get in because it's so lucrative and the working conditions are so good. But yeah, I don't have the percentages for you, but there have been points where the percentage of medical students who went into psychiatry was as high as 10 or 12%. During the mid 20th century, when psychoanalysis dominated, and it was seen as the way, the kind of work that scholars did if they wanted to be doctors, down to 3%, probably in the 1980s or 1970s, and then up now to 6-7% of medical school graduates applying for psychiatric residency. It used to be that residency programs, even good, very, very good ones, had to look outside the country to get enough applicants to their residencies, to foreign medical schools, and they're less and less compelled to go after that broader pool.
Well, I think it's time for us to wrap up. I really love the positive statements that you were making, that there's some reason for optimism here. Is there a final message you'd like to leave our audience with?
Well, it's that if culture puts stigma and mental illness together, we have the power to take it apart.
Okay. And so at an individual level, what does that mean?
Well, at an individual level, it means advocating for oneself and for others, for being open and not perpetuating the stigma of mental illness by treating mental illnesses as something that brings shame upon somebody in one's family. And I think that this charge is being led by young people mostly. I think it's led by neurodiversity advocates, people who are advocating for LGBTQ rights and trans people's rights. I think that the kind of people I teach at George Washington University, who I write about a bit in Nobody's Normal, are establishing a kind of generational shift for us. And I'm really, really optimistic about it.
Well, that's a great close. Dr. Roy Grinker, I really want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Well, I really appreciate you having me and for your interest in my book.